Hey, how's it going, everyone? Thank you for joining me on another episode of the Music Reviewer Podcast. My name's Josh, and today I'll be doing another album review for you guys. I believe this is episode 20 now of this podcast series. The 20th album review will be over the George Clanton and Nick Hexum self-titled album. George Clanton and Nick Hexum. It should be a fun album to cover. I've been sitting on this one for couple weeks now. It was released on July 23rd. I went ahead and put some other things out before that, but I'm finally ready. I think it's appropriate time to start covering this. It'll kind of follow a theme with the sequential episodes coming up next. I'm going to do a surprise worth a listen episode over a chillwave album, which that will follow the theme of with George Clanton being a somewhat of a chillwave artist, and then of course with Washed Out's recent album released, I plan on covering that as well. But yeah, before we get started here, I just want to let everyone know Best and Worst Track of the Week for the week of August 8th is out. If you haven't checked that one out, go ahead. That one's a pretty diverse episode, some good artists thrown in there. And also a brief overview of the Taylor Swift album Folklore that released not too long ago. But with no further ado, let's get started. So, if you haven't heard of George Clanton, I wouldn't be surprised. He's a somewhat of an underground and experimental artist since he's started releasing music under various monikers in 2008. But if you have heard of George Clanton, I would say that's not too surprising given that he is credited as one of the pioneers and in an internet subculture and musical genre and art aesthetic, which is called Vaporwave. And I'll get to Vaporwave here in a second. But if you are not familiar with George Clanton, he is an American producer, singer songwriter, and instrumentalist from Richmond, Virginia. He has gone by other monikers, especially with his Vaporwave stuff, such as his Spirit and then another one before that that he doesn't really use anymore. And at some point, he chose to go by his name George Clanton because he wanted to separate himself from the older name that he went by. And I think that has something to do with his recent discovery and I guess, or not discovery, but his recent endeavors into his more pop music and I guess, accessible music that features vocals, which really came about when he dropped the album Slide, which is how I discovered him, which was sometime in the late 2019 or earlier this year. I was listening to a YouTuber's internet radio that I really enjoy listening to at times. Shout out to Hype Sage. Um, and there was this track, and I was thinking it was a Tory Law track, and out of, I was picking my own brain, and I was wondering what Tory Law track is this? I've never heard of it, but to my benefit, it was not Tory Law, it was George Clanton, and I quickly became a fan whilst listening to his 2018 release Slide. And while discovering Slide, it really made sense to why I was really into it, especially since it had many elements that involve chillwave, and it's also I guess its development of the genre and its I guess fresh new sound to it that incorporated electronic elements um, that are like more present in EDM, or it was just more of an electronic album that was very lush and had a concept. But nonetheless, I like the mixture of all those elements. The album had a very dreamlike state and convincing, powerful performances as well that really brought out emotions, and it just stuck out. And then I guess it's important to touch on the vaporwave thing. If you're not familiar with vaporwave, it is really just a subgenre of electronic music that really transcends music as well. It's more of a cultural aesthetic that incorporates, visual art and like internet culture, and it aims to evoke emotions of nostalgia. And the cool thing about it is that when it makes you feel elements of nostalgia, It really kind of goes back to like these technological advances that came about like in the 80s and 90s when internet was becoming a thing, and the music sounds pretty retro. And really, the way that it happens is with just samples of like these subdued musical genres like smooth jazz, lounge music, elevator music, whatever you call it, and then slowing it down to a very slow tempo to where it feels like a completely new song, and you can just texture whatever you want on top of it, and it creates this retro effect to where it's quite enchanting. It's heavy and it's rich, but that is really just George Clanton in a nutshell. He's really kind of like the savant of electronic music that's been going with his musical endeavors since the late 2000s, and it has, I guess, evolved to what we have today under his name and moniker, George Clanton. Uh, if you're interested in his earlier thing, he went as Mirror Kisses, and his Vaporwave instrumental stuff is under his spirit. He also owns the label that this album with Nick Hexum was released on 100% Electronica. He's super. I find this really interesting as well with him. He's a very DIY guy. He owns his own record label. He promotes artists on there that he is a fan of. His girlfriend is another artist that is on that label. That is another talented electronic musician. Um, but also they're just doing cool things. They stream a lot. If you ever want to look up their YouTube channel and Twitch channel, I think 100% Electronica. He has a virtual music. He recently, due to COVID-19, released a virtual musical festival, but he also has a music festival, 100% Electronic Con. So he's kind of creating his own scene and just kind of piggybacking off of like this vaporwave scene as well. But uh, we should probably also address Nick Hexum since he is the other counterpart of this band. He Nick Hexum is quoted as saying that he doesn't contribute nearly as much as George Clanton on this, but I still think he's really important to this album. Um, he is if you're not familiar with Nick Hexum, he's from the very successful rock band from the 90s, 311, which formed in Omaha, Nebraska in 1988 after Nick Hexum moved back to his original hometown of Omaha from LA after trying to make it there. I would describe 311 as really being just a new metal band with a bit of a softer image than other ones at the time, such as Korn or Linkin Park. But they also were more experimental, I think, especially with their music that incorporated stuff like reggae and ska. They're a very like loose, relaxed, tropical sounding band, in my opinion. They have a sort of like bro vibe to them, but nonetheless, they have stayed relevant and have a cult following, and they release music to this day and are still very successful. But nonetheless, let's talk about the music that George Clanton and Nick Hexum make. And really, this album is really just an extension, I think, of George Clanton's discography. Nick Hexum just happened to be one of George Clanton's influences. So uh, I guess I don't know the whole story, but they somehow ended up meeting, and they were interested in working with each other, and it ended up being kind of a match made in heaven because apparently um, they were able to churn out an album without even really working together in an actual physical studio. I think Nick Hexum really just provided mainly just vocals and maybe some guitar lines, but the melodies that he sings and the guitar hooks that he writes were extremely influential or just essential to this album. And what we get is a an album that's very similar to like chillwave music, which I haven't really said much about chillwave, but chillwave was something that I believe came about in the late 2010s, mainly with these electronic music producer, songwriter, instrumentalist types that did everything, such as Tori Moore, Washed Out. Um, there's some other ones that I can't dig too deep right now. They're not coming to me, but they're they kind of were side by side almost with Vaporwave as well. But chillwave was like this electronic music that just had a very relaxed mood to it that features a lot of like groove with especially with their synths and bass and then like these sultry vocal lines. But it ended up kind of dying, and now we just kind of have artists that are, you know, reminiscent of it, that don't really care for that chill wave label anymore. I'd say Washed Out and Tory Mall probably moved past that, but nonetheless, their influence on indie in that 2010s was very heavy. Um, I feel like that's part of the reasons indie rock is kind of in the state it is now, to where it's kind of just become this almost like, I guess, very accessible, synthetic, almost, dream pop, synth pop, indie pop stuff. It's just become more accessible, and I think you have albums like Anything in Return by Tori Want to thank for that. But nonetheless, this album kind of it gives me a little bit of its influence. This album probably took influence from that because it is a very nostalgic sounding album. Um, it's tropical sounding. Is I guess that's where the 311 influence comes from. It's lucid, it's dreamlike, and it's supposed to be a summer album. I've seen interviews with them, and that's what their goal was. If you look at the album cover, it has weed references and kind of just like being out on a beach, and it's kind of taking you to a moment in time when things were better or something. And I'll go track by track now. I'll start actually talking about what's in the music. And it the album kicks off with the title Aurora Summer. This is a track that has very bright synth textures, a dreamlike ambience, some melodic guitars that soar across the soundscape. The summer hook, the line when they sing "summer," is great. It's like very 311 vocal like, of course, with Nick Hexum being in there. That's what you're gonna get. Some sparkling bright embellishments. Has a 90s record scratch, so I found that to be interesting. That was essential to a lot of new metal bands, so you kind of have that influence in there too. The track ends with a ambient light outro, and I'll have to say that many times especially when Nick Hexum sings that summer line, it really has similarities to like something that maybe the Gorillaz might have put out at one point. Just thought that was a note that I put there. It's not a bad track. Out of the Blue is probably one of the better tracks on the song. It's the second track. It has a nice bouncy synth melody in the intro. Very memorable melodies, especially in those vocal lines and the synths. And I'd say that's a common reoccurrence on this album. A lot of those opening synth and guitar lines are quite hooky and memorable. Out of Blue has a heavy kick drum that's kind of just soaks the track up. Um, it has kind of the same nature and ambience of the previous track, so immediately you kind of get like as an overall aesthetic. It fades out nicely in the instrumentals after one of the choruses, so there's some dynamics thrown in, some wave-like crescendos constantly enveloping everything, and I thought it was a good track. Um, we'll skip over the next track and go to Driving in My Car as one of the highlights I thought was quite good on this album. It has another melodic guitar line that introduces the track, almost like a synth tone. Um, but then I guess this is like something I would like to point out too. There's a lot of like these bright tones that can probably guitar, but they sound like synth lines. So again, going back to like this electronic music concept with that goes back to the chill wave and vaporwave influence. Um, this track features a nice groove, some scratchy guitar lines. It sounds disco-like or funk-like. The Nick Hexum vocals are mechanical, but they're not bad. It's more for aesthetic and I guess to have a style. And there's more ambience on this track. It I'd say something atypical about this is that the songwriting is atypical. There's not much lyrical contrast. It's pretty much the same melody or line sung over and over many times. I do like the track though. I like the lush guitar chords played at the end of the melodic lines, samples, and there's a sample of a strange alarm sound noise thing that is incorporated towards the end. It gives the track more a kind of uncomfortable sense. And we'll skip over to Crash Pad, which is a couple songs over. I thought this was a great song as well. There's some wonky melodies that are thrown in to kick off the track, so they sound a little uncomfortable or just out of character. Kind of like a really thin guitar line, but it's almost like a folk instrument from like the eastern part of the world. Um, it also features some eerie synth tones, some nice pulsing guitar lines thrown in. Uh, the track is really killer when the drum track kicks in, and that's something I like to point out. The drum tracks on this are incredible. They give the songs a pulse, and they give it a character and energy. So kudos on that, on those. Um, the song has some nice embellishments with like these wind instruments, some 311 like rapping from Nick Hexum, and I like the melodic verses he does as well. There's like a trance-like feel to this, some deep synth lines that are tasteful and support these big moments in the track. And the next song, King for a Day, is another highlight. The song starts with a vocal line, some synth accompaniment with like these eerie tones, a dark color, a mysterious character. The drum tracks are starting to sound quite similar. This is another track where they it's you kind of get the I guess a lot of the mood from the drum track, like in the previous song. There's some more record scratches thrown in here. I like the transition to the more stripped down instrumental interludes as well. It's a very cool sounding song. And then we get like this prelude. I think it's more of like a interlude track, Time of Wandering. It has like these echoey vocal interlude with effects that Hexum does. It's pretty. I thought that was pretty nice as well. Time of Wandering is the next track after that. This is by far the most pop-like song. It's bright, it's upbeat, the melody kicks it off. Um, I like the syncopated hi-hat that's thrown in. The drum tack sounds almost hip-hop like. Some nice transitions to the chorus or pre-chorus. There's kind of like a drop, electronic music drop, but that transition that happens between the verse and whatever comes next is really nice. It has like quick melodic synth embellishments that are timed just perfectly to give the track a lot of character. The track has a lot of groove in the instrumental as well. Thought it was a good track. And Shouldn't Have Done That is the last song that we have here. Um, it has more of like a classic George Clanton type of sound. So if you ever heard Slide or his previous work, it kind of reminds me of that. It has a nice chorus delay guitar effect thing going on, and more of a somber mood. It's kind of like the album knows it's about to come to an end. It's another killer transition to the drum track. When that drum track comes in, it's great. It has a drawn out instrumental interludes between the verses, so it's not a very vocal, like sung type of song. It's very instrumental. The song is a bit short lived, I'd say, though. It's a little, I guess, on the short side. I wish that there was a little bit more. And the song doesn't really have much of a bridge, so it more of like those atypical songwriting, like driving in my car that we saw there. And then the album ends like that. It kind of leaves you wanting more. I'd say that this album maybe at times could have used a little bit more development, um, like driving in my car. Even though that's a great song and it puts you in a mood, it's kind of just a vibe. But it feels like they probably could have maybe gone for a little bit more. Maybe uh, actually put some verses in or some sort of bridge. Um, like and should have done that as well. So overall, I thought that was a good album. It's definitely something that is a little unconventional, especially with this underground artist like George Clanton that really has like a underground following and a rock star like Nick Hexum come together. That I don't think I've really seen anything like that. Um, and their genres aren't really similar at all either. Um, even even though they're kind of in the more of the rock type of genre, it's really interesting that this album came about. It's a shame that they weren't able to tour it either, because I think a tour would have definitely promoted this album a lot more. And unfortunately, I think it might fall by the wayside because of the, I guess, lack of being on a major label or a tour. Um, but I thought the track did what it had to do. It evoked those emotions of being relaxed during a summer, I guess, outing, or just being on a beach, or just having a good time, really. And with that kind of things, with those kind of things being so limited today, I feel like it was appropriate that this album came out, because it kind of it accomplishes that dream, that dreaminess, that those genres that it takes from like chillwave aim to do. Um, but I guess I liked it. I'd say it's a 7 out of 10. Maybe I wish there's bigger moments, or I guess more grooviness at times. I'd say the album maybe suffers a little bit too much by being saturated in itself. If you're not in the mood to listen to it, it's probably not going to be an album you enjoy listening to, due to the fact that it's just mainly this one texture and this one aesthetic coming at you all at once. And if you need a bit of a pick me up, there's not much energy in a lot of the tracks. You're not going to get these, I guess, faster tempo tracks. It's all going to be kind of mid tempo and relaxed, kind of like if you're, I mean, it kind of aims to just be there for someone that's maybe high out of their mind. Uh, but music can be interpreted many different ways. That's just kind of how I see it. But it, it it's a nice sound. I like what they did. And if you can kind of get lost in those sounds, listen to the album for what it is, and just kind of take away like the performances that Nick Hexum does, as I guess just being there to, uh, I guess, achieve an aesthetic. I don't really think there's anything else to it. You're not going to get like these powerful Aretha Franklin type vocals at anywhere, or something that you're just going to be blown away from. But at the end of the day, I think it's just done tastefully. And if you're interested in, I guess, anything from chill wave or electronic, I guess, different electronic music, or if you're a fan of George Clanton, you're gonna like this album. If you're a 311 fan, you're just interested in Nick Hexum, you're probably gonna like this too, because Nick Hexum is prominent. He's the only vocalist, and he's doing his harmonies, and they sound great. And it's over a different soundscape than with getting 311. And that's kind of what I like about this album. It's new, it's experimental, and it ended up being, in my opinion, decent. So, uh, if you're made it to the end of this episode, thanks for joining me on another episode of the Music Report Podcast. My name is Josh. We'll be covering much more music soon, and take care of yourself.